All right, hi everyone. Welcome back. And just taking a look at who's here. Okay. We're going to be switching some of the focus of the discussions today. Now we'll be thinking and talking about solar in local historic districts and around historic structures. And I think we was a great segue to learn from Ben about how can we make our homes as efficient and as tight as possible. And I think that was for those of you who were here yesterday, or if you missed Nathaniel Green's keynote, that was a big focus of his discussion. Was it is great to get on renewable energy if you can, but there's things that you could do to make your house as tight as possible before moving forward. So I will be presenting now, and then we'll be hearing after me from Holly Backus at the town in Nantucket, and we'll be hearing about what Nantucket's guidelines are, and then we'll have a panel of homeowners who've installed solar on their homes on Nantucket, and then we'll be ending the day with sort of going back out to that bigger picture and meeting with folks from the Envision Resilience Nantucket Challenge. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Okay. It's weird to be on this end. I'm on the other side where I can see everything, and now I can't. I can only see the screen. So what I've been really interested in the last couple of years thinking about solar and historic districts. Can you integrate solar into a local historic district? How is that done? So I'm going to look at a couple of different case studies, introduce you to a couple of principles, or maybe reintroduce you to a couple of principles and theories that have been kind of informing my thinking. I'd like to, remind, I am not an expert on solar energy. I am merely a public historian who is interested in seeing how we can relate all these things together. So that's the oldest house on that picture there, Nantucket's so-called oldest house, built in 1686. And the reason why I chose that picture, and sorry for the street noise down below, is because a lot of houses on Nantucket and older houses in general were built to take advantage of the solar gain. So I've been thinking about that in the back of my head a little bit as well. And just thinking about what Ben was talking about, and how can we, what are the traditional uses of homes? How did the natural world inform the ways in which people built their homes? How have we moved away from that? Is there a way we can get back to that so that we're thinking on those terms? So I kind of touched on this a little bit yesterday when I was talking to Nathaniel, but I often ask myself, if I could go back in time, what would I want to talk to the people who lived here 200 years ago most about? And if you're doing a lot of research in one place for a decent amount of time, whether it's Nantucket or your own town, or wherever you are interested in, you start to see the same names over and over again, and you start to feel a little bit like the people who lived there. You know what they did for a living, you know where they lived, you know who they married, you know how many children they had. You can sort of start to infer a little bit about their life. And I think the number one thing I would want to ask them at this point in time is, what would the whalers have thought of solar power? These people who were at sea for 4 or 5 years at a time, these very long voyages, all in the name of going after a fuel source, essentially. Whale oil lit the world, lubricated machines. It was a clean burning fuel. And I wonder, what would the whalers think if you told them, you could get energy to power your house from the sun? So I don't know. I can't ask them that. So I have to let that thought just percolate in my head. And the other thing I want us to think about today as I'm presenting this is, what's the goal of historic preservation? Is it to freeze time? Is it to manage change? Is it to maintain a connection to the past? Is it to reconstruct the past, or our version of the past, or somebody else's version of the past? Is it to never change, freeze things in amber? Is it to be in a museum? Is it to learn from those who came before us? Is it to enhance local and national pride? I think it's some of those things. I don't think it's some of those other things. I think you could, I really do think that the goal of historic preservation is to manage change. We don't live in museums. We heard just from what Ben and Historic New England were doing with their house museums, but most people who live in historic properties, their homes have been updated. We have running water, electricity, things like that. You walk down the street, there are cars on the street. On Nantucket, there are cars parked on our historic sidewalks. We have power lines on Nantucket. Some of the power lines are buried. We have some pretty big power lines that were just put in by National Grid to manage the amount of people that are here. So it's a question about what visual intrusions, or I like the word visual, this idea of visual noise, have we allowed? What will we need to allow? What sort of compromises and balances will need to be made? So those are some thoughts. And then as it relates to solar, there are a couple of Secretary of the Interior standards that are kind of informing a lot of the guidelines as they relate. I'm not going to get into what Nantucket's guidelines are, because Holly will be doing that next. But, we're thinking about the Secretary Standard 2, which is the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. So the removal of historic materials, the alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. And then Standard 9, which is that any new addition or exterior addition alterations does not destroy the historic materials that characterize the property. And the new should be differentiated from the old. So I wanted to touch on the idea of the principle of reversibility. And this is as defined by Michael Petzet in Principles of Preservation, an introduction to the ICOMOS charters for restoration 40 years after the Venice Charter. The idea that reversibility in preservation is the option of being able to reestablish in as unlimited a manner as possible the previous condition, means deciding in favor of a more harmless or sometimes simply more intelligent solutions, and avoiding irreversible alterations, which often end with an irreversible loss of the monument as a historic document. So not wanting to change the property, the historic fabric of a property, if you were to install a solar installation on a roof, or on the ground, not wanting to affect that character, and also anything that's done should be reversible, I think are two big takeaways that we should think about. As we start to look around and think about solar power on buildings, on historic buildings, the design of the buildings matters. So these are two places that are not Nantucket. We've got Beacon Hill, where the gas lantern is, and that's a whole nother conversation that we could have just about gas lanterns and trying to electrify and what's more sustainable. And then the other picture is in New York City. So historic districts where buildings have flat roofs, they tend to approve solar arrays on buildings, and especially buildings that have parapets that block the view of the roof, like row houses, often also camouflage rooftop installations. So it's interesting to think that, we've got the national standards, but then local standards are really important, because the local building styles, the vernacular architecture is really going to inform what sort of solutions make sense. I think things, really are site specific. In New York City, a fixture may be deemed appropriate, which is defined as something that does not profoundly impact the historical appearance of the building. New York's particularly interesting because they've come to understand that water towers and other modern mechanical fixtures on the roofs, they come to terms with these modern installations, these modern intrusions as they relate to historic structures. In California, there's a 1978 Solar Rights Act, which prohibits unreasonable restrictions on solar energy systems. So we're starting to see in California, a lot of people are doing more things like buying panels that look like solar energy, that look like shingles, excuse me. We talked about that with Nathaniel a bit yesterday. Solar panels that look like skylights, or people buy shares on a solar farm for tax credits. In St. Louis, there's recently been an interesting change that solar panels must be visually compatible as opposed to invisible. So the Preservation Board in St. Louis may approve solar panels that must face the street in order to obtain efficiency when they determine that every effort has been made to minimize the visual presence of the installation. So this is a technology that changes quickly, that's going to be different, or rather, there's going to be different considerations throughout different communities. And here on Nantucket, our roofs are not flat. There's not much behind a parapet. Their roofs here are pitched, peaked, sloped, and slanting. So I think that's really something to keep in mind, that you may see something that works well in another city that isn't going to work in your city or town just because of what the vernacular architectural style is. And on Nantucket, it's peaked roofs. A lot of that, going back to my first slide with the oldest house, has to do with the wind here. Wanting those salt box homes and having that shorter north facing wall and that big cat slide roof, so the wind rolls up and over the house. That makes sense. It's a little harder to put an array on a roof like that because it is going to be visible. Well, let's see. I did just want to point out, we've got to talk about the other island. Whenever you talk about Nantucket, the desire to compare to Martha's Vineyard is always there. And on Martha's Vineyard, 4 of the 6 towns have local historic districts. And I know that many of you know this, but I'll say it again. It bears repeating that Nantucket is a National Historic Landmark, and it is also a local historic district. So the whole island is a local historic district, and any change has to be approved by the Historic District Commission. On the Vineyard, it's different. They have a bunch of little districts that were established at different times. The largest has 429 houses, and that's in Oak Bluffs, and the smallest is in Tisbury, and that only has 55 properties. So it's different when you're dealing with an entire island or town where every change has to be managed versus one community. So I know that on Nantucket a little while ago, there was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, a story in the newspaper that said, wow, look at Martha's Vineyard. They've approved so many solar installations, and why haven't we approved as many? I think the answer would simply be because they don't have as many houses in local historic districts. So I don't really think it's an apples to apples comparison. However, this is the Martha's Vineyard West Tisbury Town Hall. You can see there is a little solar array up at the top there, not entirely visible. And one of the West Tisbury commissioners who voted in favor of this installation, I think he was thinking, and he was answering the question that I posed at the beginning of this. If solar panels had existed 100 years ago, people would have used them. Lanny McDowell, a West Tisbury commissioner who voted in favor of the town hall installation, said, in a way, it fits with the tradition of a New England village to approve something that saves money and makes practical sense. It also makes good design sense. If this had been a really pitched or peaked roof, maybe it wouldn't have been approved. One thing to keep in mind is the significance of a building. Some towns, I spent a lot of time looking at guidelines, solar guidelines for towns in the Cape and the South Coast and all throughout Massachusetts. And most of them are relatively similar, wanting to minimize that visual intrusion as much as possible. But I did see in Harvard, Massachusetts and in Northampton, Massachusetts, there were 2 interesting additions made, which is that highlighting the importance of the significance of the building. And in Harvard, there is a question that, solar might not be appropriate for every situation structure, and that the importance of the building, the architectural and historic importance, prominence, and significance would play into the commissioner's overall decision as to whether solar would be appropriate on that installation. In Northampton, same thing. This is for the Elm Street LHD. When considering the installation of solar panels, importance, prominence, and historic significance shall be taken into account. So do you know if your town has that addendum in their guidelines? Do they specifically call out the significance of a building has to be taken into consideration? And another question is, does your town have solar guidelines in its historic district guidelines? Nantucket does, and we have since 2009, and you'll hear all about them next. So I want to take you through two different case studies where we look at solar and historic buildings. And the first is in Bedford, Massachusetts. And in Bedford, Massachusetts, it's a town of about 14 square miles. It's 20 miles northwest of Boston with a population of about 14,000 people. That's how many people the census says Nantucket has. Whether or not we have more is a question that's for consideration. But so it's a town that's in a historic district. It is a special act historic district. We're dealing with, for the First Parish of Bedford, a UU church here. The congregation of the town dates back to 1729, and the first meeting house was built and it was blown down in 1815. The current structure, which you see here, the First Parish structure, was built in 1817, and beams from that original structure were salvaged and used in this construction. So I mentioned that only because it brings in that whole deconstruction element that we were talking about yesterday. So a great example of reuse. So Bedford, Massachusetts Historic District does allow solar panels if they adhere to the guidelines. And these are the guidelines that are right here for you. The First Parish of Bedford wanted to install solar on that church, on that roof. So they followed the guidelines. They submitted an application in April of 2016, and the application was held for more information. So the First Parish returned in May of 2016 with a new presentation that addressed some of the commissioner's concerns that related to aesthetics and visibility. It was also explained at the time that Unitarian Universalism's seventh principle, which is the respect for the interdependent web of all existence for which we are a part, was critical to their environmental commitment. This congregation wanted to get these panels on the roof in time for their 300th anniversary, which was in 2017. They wanted to achieve net zero. During this presentation, 3 of the 5 HDC commissioners in Bedford said that the solar panels were not a religious issue. And so the First Parish once again returned to the Historic District Commission of Bedford in June, and more audience members, more public, started to attend the meetings in support of the project. The Bedford Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Bedford Historic Preservation Commission, both supported the application. However, the Bedford HDC voted 3-2 against issuing a certificate of appropriateness. So they were told they couldn't put solar on the roof of the church, even though they met the guidelines that you're seeing here. So what happened next, you could probably predict. The parish committee voted to take Bedford's HDC to court. And the chair of the HDC was a member of the First Parish. So this is life in a small town. Everybody has to recuse themselves from everything all the time. We see that a lot here in Nantucket. And a Boston law firm, Sharon and Logden, agreed to take on the case pro bono. Just interesting to note that about 140 Unitarian churches across the country have put solar panels on their property, and 8 congregations are working on community solar installations. And the First Parish of all those groups was the only one to get so stymied that they entered into litigation. So Sharon and Logden argued that the HDC's decision was arbitrary and capricious, as they hadn't provided enough justification for why the application was denied. Remember that from what the First Parish said, they had met those guidelines. They also, and this is where this case gets very interesting, I think, they also argued that not approving the solar panels impinged on the congregation's religious freedoms, and affidavits from theology experts were obtained. A Middlesex Superior Court judge ordered the HDC to re-articulate their reasoning for the vote, and their new wording failed the Massachusetts standards, and the judge found that the HDC ruling had been arbitrary, and they ruled in favor of the First Parish in 2018. And the town of Bedford prepared to appeal this decision. Meanwhile, First Parish members prepared a citizen's petition warrant article for town meeting that would introduce a bylaw change allowing solar panels in the historic district without HDC approval, as long as they conformed with the town's guidelines. Excuse me. And this bylaw change was approved at town meeting in a vote of 265 to 61. So if you know me, you know I love town meeting because things like this happen where you have less than 400 people making a decision for a town of 14,000. It is so important to go to town meeting. It is so important to vote. And that's what Nathaniel said. And I know that he was talking about voting in national elections, but voting in your local election and going to town meeting and paying attention to what's happening in your town is so critical. And I think we've all really seen that this past year. Our local boards of health were making decisions that were really impacting our day-to-day lives. And everything like that is happening in local government. Local government is really where it's at. So this bylaw change was approved. Everything's great, right? Well, Bedford Selectmen, the Finance Committee, and the Planning Board, they all supported this article, and the town of Bedford dropped their appeal. Remember, they were going to appeal the court's decision that the church could put the solar panels on the roof. And then the citizens petition went through, it was approved at town meeting, everything's looking great. The HDC issues a certificate of appropriateness for the church in January 2019. You can see the solar panels going up on the roof. They're there now. Okay, great. Get to put solar on your house as long as it conforms with the standard. You don't have to go to the HDC. Well, wrong. Just because you make a bylaw change at town meeting doesn't mean that it's going to be approved. Has to go up to the Attorney General, to Maura Healey's office. And in 2019, Maura Healey's office, May of 2019, disapproved the bylaw change because they proposed that exempting roof-mounted solar panels from the statutory mandated review of the Bedford HDC, that wasn't going to fly. The HDC in Bedford was created in 1964 as a special act HDC, just like Nantucket. And that act requires that the commission review and approve all exterior architecture features of a building within the local historic district. So this bylaw change was going to conflict with this requirement. So if Bedford wanted to do this, they would have to amend their special act, and then the bylaw would be implemented. So the provisions of Mass General Law Chapter 40C, which create historic districts and historical commissions, don't apply to Bedford, nor do they apply to Nantucket, because our local historic districts were created by special legislation. So Nantucket really is special, but so are a bunch of other cities and towns in Massachusetts. Going to Chapter 40, local historic districts, there are a couple, well, not a couple, what am I trying to say? Sorry. Over in Dennis, Massachusetts, over on Cape Cod, they do have a solar exemption for buildings within the Old Kings Highway Regional Historic District. Old Kings Highway was established in 1973, and it's the largest historic district in the country. It runs from Sandwich to Orleans. Each town has their own HDC for their town's portion of the Old Kings Highway Historic District. Here is a beauty spot over on Cape Cod. And Dennis, you can Google Dennis Old Kings Highway Historic District Solar Exemption if you want to read the whole thing. I put some of it on here. I thought this was a very interesting way to do it. So this is a Chapter 40C historic district. And if the application meets the requirements for a solar panel exemption, it doesn't need to be reviewed by the HDC. And that all has to do, why couldn't they do that in Bedford? Why could they do it in Dennis? It all has to do with the enabling legislation. It makes sense that in a large historic district like the Old Kings Highway District, there may be properties that are not contributing, or they're further back away from the main street, or they meet all these other recommendations, about the roof length, the roof pitch, the age. So I think that's an interesting way to do it when you've got a big district to manage. So what are some of the lessons or takeaways from the Bedford story? Well, if anybody from a local historic district commission is watching this, I think knowing your guidelines, citing your guidelines and giving specific examples when you're approving or denying an application is so critical. Had the Bedford HDC been able to really point back to some specific reasons why they denied that application, probably wouldn't, would it have been appealed? I don't know. We see this a lot in our other historic district commissions too. You can't say that you like something or you don't like something. You have to point back to the guidelines. It's really, otherwise you're opening your board, your commission, and the town up to litigation. It is challenging to keep all of the different guidelines in place and to remember those things, but I don't know. That would be my takeaway for that one. For citizens, same thing. Understand the enabling legislation of your local historic district. If you introduce a bylaw change, would you need to then amend a special act if that's approved or changed? And then also knowing what are the historic elements of your local community and the building style that's going to inform what kinds of solar installations will be appropriate. And we'll see this afternoon when we talk with some homeowners here in Nantucket. And we'll see what sorts of installations were approved. We're going to look at, one building that's right in the middle of the historic district. And I think you'll be surprised to see that it has solar. And then knowing that one of the going back to the point that I raised before about what's happening in Harvard and Northampton and other towns that specify that if a building is significant, they may or may not approve solar on that site. Does your local historic district have a process for determining the significance of a building? Because that seems like it's an important step. If the significance of a building is going to be taken into consideration when approving or denying, how do you know if a building is significant? Okay, and if you've got any other takeaways or thoughts, please put them in the chat. I'd love to know. I just really wish we could be sitting around talking. It's weird to be talking into a void. Okay, we're going to go to Rhode Island now real quick, to Tiverton, Rhode Island, okay, here we go. We're talking about a solar farm in a place that was not in a local historic district and just see what happened. So in 2018, there was a developer who made an application for a 15-acre solar array on Hart Farm, also called Wingover Farm. And existing on the property was a farmhouse built circa 1720, an old barn and a contemporary barn and a family cemetery on the property. So and it did get approved, I'll just tell you that now. If this solar farm was to get approved by the planning board, it's going to change the zoning of the property from residential to commercial. And the historic farmhouse was found to not be able to stay on the property because the two uses were not allowed on the same lot, commercial and residential. So there was the solar ordinance in Tiverton that was in effect when this application for the development was delivered to the town. And that ordinance was then later repealed in 2018, the same year this application went in, because so much farmland was being used for solar arrays, solar farms. So this farmhouse was on a list of historic structures, which was compiled by the state in 1983. And when the demolition permit is eventually applied for, the 90-day demolition, there's a 90-day demolition delay that will be enacted. I think this is so interesting and confusing to point out, but earlier in the application process for the solar farm, there was some confusion over whether or not this farmhouse, the Hart Farm, was on the state's list of historic properties. And the 1983 survey was a dashboard survey. The house couldn't be seen from the road. So even the local commissioners thought it wasn't on the list. And it was on the list, but it was on the list under this name, the Reuben Hart Farm. So knowing keeping your surveys updated and knowing what properties are or aren't on surveys is so critical. Sorry, I jumped out of order. You got to see it, but anyway, the developer offered the farmhouse to the town or a third party who wanted to move it off the property, but the cost of such a move had been quoted at $100,000 to $200,000, so it was prohibitive. Tiverton does not have any historic zoning or other statutes or ordinances in place to protect this house. This house was outside of any districts. And the chairwoman of the town's Historic Preservation Authority Advisory Board said in February 2020, they had tried to put historic districts in the town, but they kept getting voted down. So preservationists then asked for a zoning variance to allow for 2 uses on the property. Well, here it is now. I don't know if you can see in the corner there is where that farm is. So the farmhouse is still there. The solar farm was given final approval by the planning board of March of 2020, and the solar field came online in March of this year. The future of the farmhouse still remains in question, and it's in limbo, and it's on the Tiverton Historic Preservation Advisory Board's list of threatened properties. So they didn't take it down yet, and I hope that there's a solution reached. But that definitely is a jarring scene, right? To see that field with the farmhouse there. Talk about the historic character of an area. So what's the lesson here? Well, I think the number one lesson for this is knowing that you can't protect what you didn't measure or inventory or survey. And on Nantucket, so happy to say, we are updating our surveys. We had surveys done in 1989, and Nantucket's Historical Commission has applied for and gotten a grant and put out an RFP, and is, I think, reviewing proposals right now to update some of our historic surveys, because that one of the things, and again, I'm not an expert, I don't live in this town, and I tried to learn as much as I could, but the point being that from reading the newspaper accounts of what was going on in Rhode Island, it was really not understood that this house was on a list of historic properties. And so these permits were issued, and then later finding that it was on this list, and there was going to be this delay once it went into effect. So just knowing what you're dealing with, I think we're on Nantucket, our biggest asset really is that every structure here is in the local historic district. I know that can be a challenge. Managing a district of this size is a Herculean task, and our historic district commission meets for, all told, 6+ hours a week, every week, to review these applications. But if you're living in a town that doesn't have a historic district, this can be a challenge. So then I asked myself again, just where I started off before, which is what the goal of a local historic district. And I really liked this line from Harvard, Massachusetts, which is, while historic districts may exist to maintain a sense of the past, they must work with innovations now considered essential. Paved roads, electrical and electronic lines, and sewage treatment systems are examples. So how can we best maintain a sense of the past while planning for the future? Whether that's planning for sea level rise, planning for growth. We know that Nantucket's growing. We know that it grew by 40% in the last census. We know that was the biggest growth change in the state by county. So we know that these things are coming. We know that climate change is a threat to us as well. How can we maintain the things that are so important about Nantucket while we adapt, while we move forward? Because it isn't a museum. It's a town that's alive and full of people who are living here, making their day-to-day lives. And I think knowing what it is that you want to protect, whether that's by doing surveys, really sitting down and saying, what are the character defining features of this house or this neighborhood? What makes Sconset different from Quidnet? What makes Quidnet different from Surfside? What are the things that we would really miss if they were gone? I think that's the best way to think about it. When you look at a house, when you look at a neighborhood, what are the things that if they weren't there, you would notice? Those are the character defining features. So if we can inventory those things and know what it is that we're seeking to protect, then I think we can see, and we will see that, Nathaniel showed us that map. There's a lot of solar that's been approved in Nantucket. Don't believe the hype that you might read. There's a lot that's happening that's really good as we balance modernity and historic preservation. So that's my presentation. How do I get out of here? Stop share. Okay. Mary, so if anybody, this is weird to moderate myself, but thank you for that. I hope that gave you a couple of things to think about. Mary Longacre says, it seems that it's very important for the community to have conversations about goals for solar installations that can help guide the development of regulations, so everyone agrees on how important installing solar is to that community. Yeah, it was an interesting thing to read about Rhode Island, where they had introduced these, they went back and repealed some of the legislation because they felt like too much was slipping away. So again, Nantucket, we're very lucky to have so much open space that's already there. Will ask, are there any cities or towns that have had their national historic landmark status revoked because of solar installations? Actually, I don't know. It's a good question. I would be happy to look into that. It's, also important. I know that we love talking about our landmark status, and it is so critical and so important in so many different ways. But the real truth is that our local historic district is the thing that's protecting us. National historic landmark status is really, it's an honorific. It's very helpful when you're dealing with the federal government, but at the day-to-day decisions, it's the local historic district that's looking out for us. So. Great. All right, well, I think we're going to take a little, another little break before Holly comes back, and we take a look at just what's happening on Nantucket. And we look forward to seeing you at 11:15.